There we go.
Now we are live. Now we are live. That took a moment. Calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, calling with Beyer in Chicago.
Greetings from Chicago, Chris. How you doing?
I'm doing well.
What's going on there in the great state of England?
The
Our
great
country? I thought it was the 51st colony or something. I get a little confused.
Well, you are a colonial, so we can only expect so
I'm
much.
a former subject, or subject to the former power of Her Majesty.
It's warm and sunny here.
Excellent. Well, it's 35 and sunny here, so not too bad. We are going to get snow today. And I want to say hello to everybody who's joining us, and we'll wait a moment to get started so people can kind of sign in, and please post something and let us know that you're here. And, of course, we're here talking about history every Sunday, like it or not, at 4 p.m. Eastern on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube pages. And all of our broadcasts are also archived on the History Happy Hour webpage. And Chris, I thought maybe I should just mention to people that if you wanted to go to the History Happy Hour webpage, it's on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours website. And you really can get there right from the front page. It's pretty easy. So that's also where our reading list is, and future shows and all that sort of information. So Chris, who have we got joining us today in the audience category?
We've got, Ken, hello, Doreen, and Nancy, Richard Flint. Oh, they're joining us so quick. They're scrolling quickly.
Excellent. Well,
Jack Sadler. Hey, Jack. How's it going?
I saw Karen is from the east coast of Canada, so we wanted to know where in Canada that means.
Yes.
You know, Newfoundland? I mean, which coast? There's a number of east coasts in Canada, aren't there?
Well, I guess you could look at it that way.
My ignorance
You're digging deep.
is really
stick
showing
Stick with history, Rick.
Stick with history. So,
yeah.
Chris, do you think we've reached a critical mass here that we can
believe
move forward?
I believe so.
Drum roll.
Brrr. The bar is open.
The bar is open. So welcome, everybody. And our guest today has written a book that is centered on the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg, but is really, I would say, a close-up look at the experiences of 5 people and how this battle impacted them. And John Madison, I should have checked the pronunciation of his name, so we'll ask him about that in a moment, is a professor of English and legal writing at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City, and he won the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for Biography for his first book, Eden's Outcasts, the story of Louisa May Alcott and her father. Is he our first Pulitzer Prize winner? Chris, do you remember? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure.
He is a graduate of Harvard Law School and also has a Ph.D. in English from Columbia, which strikes me as a rare and intimidating combination. And his new book is A Worse Place Than Hell: How the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg Changed a Nation. John, how are you?
I could not be better right now, Rick. How are you?
Excellent. And how badly did I mangle your last name?
You did just fine with it. And, you get to a certain point and you just stop being picky anyway. So
when do I get to that point?
You get there a lot, Rick. You get there a lot, actually.
The funny thing about it was my arch rival in high school had the last name of Madison, Madison. And we always sat next to each other. We were next to each other in the roll and so forth. And so it was like Steve Ovett and Sebastian Coe or something. We were always kind of against.
And how many Pulitzer Prizes does he have now?
He doesn't have any.
Yeah, all right.
Put his mind to it.
I
bet
go.
if you tried.
But if you just tried a little harder.
So, John, did you bring a cocktail with you today?
I did actually. I salute you with it. Shall I describe it?
Yes, please.
Okay, well,
this is the most important part of the show.
And then we can stop. Okay, and we'll just drink. But anyway, this is a toasted almond, which is amaretto, Kahlua, and either milk or cream, depending on how dietetic you are. And it actually takes me also back to my high school days and my very good friend, Jimmy the Jet Bremner, because Jimmy the Jet, actually, I had my first beer with. And also introduced me to these little numbers. And he was a great role model because basically every time that he stopped studying, I started. And so he actually said once about schoolwork that the sooner you get behind, the more time you have to catch up, which kind of works, but then doesn't work. But anyhow, so this is my tribute to Jimmy the Jet, and
Jimmy, wherever you are.
Indeed, he's in LA soaking up the sunshine, so he's doing fine.
Greetings to Jimmy the Jet. Chris, do you have a cocktail?
I do. I have an old fashioned. Now, I should say that in honor of today's show, my daughter wanted to try to make mint juleps. So we went to one of the few open stores here in London, and she asked for a silver or copper cup in which to make the mint julep, and they weren't having any of that, so we opted for the old-fashioned.
So no mint juleps. I just have a beer in a nice FBI glass, so keep an eye out for the FBI. So, John, I mentioned the title of your book, but I want to just flash it up here. It's A Worse Place Than Hell, How the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg Changed a Nation. And your book is kind of part history and it's part biography, and it's an examination of how war changes people. So tell us a little bit about it, about the concept there, and about what led you to write it.
Yeah, sure. The book kind of started with a question, which was, what would happen if I tried to tell a story of a military event, but not from the standpoint of its economic or political ramifications, but rather its cultural ramifications? And I already had a little bit of a amateur's background in the Civil War, and so I kind of ended up being guided to the Battle of Fredericksburg, and the Battle of Fredericksburg basically involves the near intersection of, as you've said, 5 really interesting lives: Louisa May Alcott, Walt Whitman, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Arthur Fuller, and John Pelham. The first 3 names are probably familiar to your audience. The others maybe not so. Arthur Fuller was a chaplain in the for the 16th Massachusetts Regiment, and was the younger brother of a much more famous Fuller, and that's Margaret Fuller, about whom I wrote my second book. And then John Pelham is the only Southerner in the group. And there he is in a nice colorized image with his very haunting gaze. He was from sort of the tail end of Appalachia as it dips down into Alabama. Really beautiful country, which I've had the pleasure to visit. But he was an artillery major who had just left West Point. He was on the verge of graduating when the war broke out. And he tried very hard to stick around, get his diploma, but eventually had to leave without it. And he ends up being the commander of a unit called the Stuart, as in Jeb Stuart, Horse Artillery, and he distinguishes himself at Fredericksburg and beyond. But anyhow, what's neat about these stories is that they do tie in to kind of the future of American culture, in that Louisa May Alcott becomes the writer she becomes because of her experiences in the war. She was a nurse at a Georgetown hospital and began her service directly after the Battle of Fredericksburg. And it's kind of my contention in the book that if she had not had that experience, various other events would not have taken place, and she would not have written Little Women. And so the entire face of American children's juvenile fiction would have been completely transformed. Walt Whitman also comes into the war as a nurse. He comes in much more by happenstance. His brother George was several years younger, about 10 years younger than Walt. And George gets wounded at Fredericksburg. And Walt, who is kind of on the skids at that time and is spending a lot of time in an underground bar, literally underground in Manhattan, called Fops, sitting back and watching bohemians kind of drown themselves in drink.
That sounds terrible.
Yep, here we go. And he sees in a newspaper account that just a list of casualties. He sees the name Lieutenant G.W. Whitmore. And General Sherman has this great line about how glory means being killed in battle and having your name spelled wrong in the papers. Well, George wasn't killed, but he was wounded. And so Walt just dropped everything to go down to Fredericksburg to find him. And then after that, kind of gets a calling to spend the rest of the war, more or less, working as informally as a nurse, without a commission and without pay, in the Union hospitals in D.C. So I think I've covered most of them. I don't think I've mentioned Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's kind of in some ways, he's the center of the book. And the person I spend most time on, in part because he lives so long. He lives until the 1930s. But Holmes has an odd experience at Fredericksburg that leads him to question the justice of the universe. It leads him to question the nature of duty and how much one owes to a society or to an army or to one's fellow human beings. And a lot of his thought that gets triggered by his war experiences really manifests itself in his legal theory. And apart from a handful of justices, John Marshall, Earl Warren, perhaps, Justice Holmes is probably the most significant justice ever to sit on the court. And what's amazing about it is that he becomes a Supreme Court judge after he's had these experiences that have taught him that fairness doesn't necessarily exist, and that life is governed by force and happenstance much more than it's governed by written rules. And so he becomes a fascinating legal figure and someone who deeply leaves his imprint on American life as well.
Are you done, Rick?
A little trigger finger flashing.
It was kind of fun going in and out.
Yes, that's not
the disco version.
That's not a signal, but now that we've done it once, maybe it will become one.
Okay,
good.
So, John, what are the things I'm curious? We'll talk a lot. We'll focus on the personalities, but really briefly, the Battle of Fredericksburg, it kind of gets forgotten about or gets a lot less coverage in the pantheon of Civil War battles. So if you could just kind of give us a brief overview of this fight or this campaign, and maybe touch on why you think it has been not given the attention it deserves.
Yeah, sure. Well, Fredericksburg takes place at the end of 1862. The fighting there begins on December 11th of 62. The most costly fighting takes place 2 days later on the 13th, and then there's some scattered action after that. But why Fredericksburg mattered in the moment has a few answers to it. One of them is that it's the first major battle that the Army of the Potomac fought after Lincoln finally gave up on General George McClellan, who was beloved by his troops, but was not the most loyal man in various ways. You read McClellan's letters, and he refers to Lincoln as a baboon and things like that. And there are concerns that McClellan could become something of a demagogue and could end up actually taking over the government. But in any event, McClellan is he's very cautious. He always assumes that Lee has a lot more troops at his disposal than he actually does. And so McClellan is reluctant to engage. When he does engage, very often it's kind of piecemeal. The plans aren't well thought out, and things kind of fall to pieces. And so Lincoln replaces him before the Battle of Fredericksburg with General Ambrose Burnside. And the hope is that Burnside is going to be more aggressive. And Burnside is a very humble man. He's authentically modest. And he keeps telling people, I'm not up to this. I don't think I can command a whole army. And they say, oh, come on, you can do this.
Yeah, I know he
was. What could be hard, right? And unfortunately, his modesty is well-founded because Burnside, gets, involved in the Battle of Fredericksburg, and his judgment kind of freezes up, and he decides that really the only option open to him, in part because he's been, told to be more aggressive, is to throw doomed assault after doomed assault at a very well entrenched Confederate position in a place called Marie's Heights on the outskirts of Fredericksburg. And it turns out to be just an absolute disaster, a slaughter and just an unnecessary waste of of humanity in a war that involved a lot of waste of humanity. But Fredericksburg stood out for a lot of people for its futility and for it, finally the sort of the inadvertent cruelty of Burnside's lack of strategic and tactical vision. But what also matters about Fredericksburg is that it takes place just a couple of weeks before the Emancipation Proclamation is supposed to take effect. And Lincoln very, very much wanted to have one good, solid victory under his belt in the Virginia theater in order to convince people that not only could he proclaim freedom for the slaves, but he had the military force to make it stick. And Burnside's blunder at Fredericksburg goes a long way to disproving Lincoln's ability to enforce that will. And so Lincoln is thrown into very near despair. Three of his major cabinet members offer their resignations. And he says to one of his friends after Fredericksburg, if there's a worse place than hell, I'm in it. And that, in fact, is where I get the title of the book from. And so it's a test of Lincoln's resolve. A later test of Lincoln's resolve was shown in the Daniel Day-Lewis movie Lincoln, where the question is, will he push the 13th Amendment? The Fredericksburg crisis is kind of a dress rehearsal for that, because it's also a question of how strong is Lincoln's resolve? How willing is he to put his reputation, to put his administration on the line and proclaim emancipation? At a moment when his forces look extraordinarily weak.
So okay. I wanted to jump in, and I can see, by the way, that the sun is peering through your window and is going to start getting in your eyes in a moment.
Yeah, so. I might be able to do something about that if you hang on for a sec.
Sure, we'll talk amongst ourselves for a moment.
All right, just a second.
That's what you get for having sunshine. See?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not fair to have sunshine, I think.
Okay, that's going to fix it. I've lost.
I was just concerned that you were going to get a blast there, and we wanted to be careful in that. Apropos to what you were saying, one of our viewers points out, and I don't know that the number here is exactly correct. It depends on how you count it. But the Union forces charge up Marye's Hill many times, and in fact, in the Battle of Fredericksburg, in some of the attacks that up in the hill in the afternoon, there are men lying on the ground who are clutching at the ankles or jackets of the charging soldiers and say, "Don't charge, don't charge! You'll just get killed." And I think, and Chuck says it's hard today for us to understand why they followed these insane and suicidal orders. And I think it really is hard to understand, both why you'd keep throwing good after bad and why men in that situation are willing to do it. What impels them? It's tough.
Yeah. Are you asking me to answer that question?
Yeah. Or? Well, you can make a comment.
That or you could just open up the window and say, "I'm sorry, I can't see."
Because you could say, "Fascinating, Rick," and you can ask me a question, but I wouldn't. That's not the basic format. So.
Well, obviously, I've never stood in those shoes, and I've never been in the situation where someone was urging me forward into something that looked very much like certain death. I have a good friend with whom I've talked about the book a lot, and he refers to these charges up Marye's Heights as being like being on the conveyor belt of the wood chipper. And in fact, one of the kind of secondary figures in the book is a young soldier whom Louisa May Alcott befriends after the battle, and he is one of those soldiers who, in the very last assault of the day, has his pant leg clutched at by wounded soldiers saying, "Don't go, don't go." Why do you do it? You do it because you don't want to disgrace yourself in front of the people, the men next to you, that you feel an obligation to them, that and justly so. No one wants to be seen as a coward, and it's not only that. I mean, I think about it very much in terms of Holmes's experience. Now, it turns out that Holmes is spared the gunfights at Fredericksburg because, as it so happens, he's developed a case of dysentery and he's stuck in a hospital tent on the other side of the river, and so he never sees combat. at Fredericksburg, and he carries that guilt with him for the rest of his life, really. But Holmes had some interesting things to say about military courage after the war. At the time, he was very ambivalent about it because he was seeing all of his friends get shot to pieces. He himself was wounded 3 different times, and was horrified by the war at the time. But as years passed and he looked back on it and he was trying to make sense of the world, he was trying to figure out if there was any kind of animating principle to the cosmos. Okay. And he looks for it in the army, and he looks for it in the law, and he looks for it in religion, and he doesn't find anything that really finally makes sense. But something that does shine forth to him, and this is hard to understand as well, but I'll read it to you. This is from a speech that he gives in the 1890s, and very much on the subject of Fredericksburg. He says, "I do not know what is true. I do not know the meaning of the universe. But in the midst of doubt, in the collapse of creeds, there is one thing that I do not doubt, that no man who lives in the same world with most of us can doubt, and that is that the faith is true and adorable, which leads a soldier to throw away his life in obedience to a blindly accepted duty, in a cause which he little understands, in a plan of campaign of which he has no notion, under tactics of which he does not see the use." It's amazing that he regards this, he uses the word lovely. And it's not lovely. It's repellent. It's horrible. And yet it was the one thing that he could turn to as a source of truth. And I think that what that paragraph I've read you does is it kind of places him in the position of the first American existentialist. He's the man who looks around him, looks across a battlefield, and later looks across a country, and sees absurdity, but says that humanity is won by carrying on in the face of that absurdity, knowing it's crazy, but still doing what you have to do. It's a horrible, frightening doctrine, but it's the one thing that to him stands up and has solidity as he moves forward in life.
So John, now a lot of the characters, or most of the characters in your book, are New Englanders. And as we all know, New England is the center of the universe, and all good things come from New England. However,
hub of the universe.
It is the hub of the universe.
Boston, yes,
without question. But what I was curious about was, given the kind of the New England flavor of these people, is there similar kinds of conversations going on in the South? Or is there a Southern young literary elite trying to kind of come to terms with this, or are these kind of a unique collection of characters that we're looking at here?
Yeah, interesting question, Chris, and I'll answer it in a second. I just remembered there was a portion of another question that I didn't.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, that's okay. I'd forgotten it for a second, but that is, why has Fredericksburg kind of faded in public memory, whereas perhaps a battle like Gettysburg, people still recognize the name. You'll notice even from the title of my book, it includes the words "How the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg ... because there was concern from the editors of Norton that the name Fredericksburg wouldn't ring bells with people. And I think the reason that it hasn't really survived, it's really twofold. One is that I think possibly the typical person only makes enough room in their minds for a few facts relating to any particular phenomenon. Such that people remember Frank Sinatra now and don't really remember Bing Crosby, except for White Christmas, because there's kind of space for one crooner. Right. And there's kind of only a certain amount of space that the typical person has, and also you get exposed to this in high school for an afternoon, and then it's on to something else. But also, Fredericksburg doesn't survive in popular memory because it didn't, in terms of military and political outcome, it didn't change anything. it was just another sort of downward step in that decline of the Union fortunes that then gets reversed in July of 1863 with the twin victories at Gettysburg and out west at Vicksburg. And so in that sense, Fredericksburg doesn't change any trajectories. But the argument of the book is that it dramatically changes the trajectories for Holmes and Alcott and Pelham and Whitman, such that Whitman's poetry transforms, Alcott's writing transforms, Holmes is thinking about justice. All of that is stamped by Fredericksburg, but that's not as visible as the turning of the tide at Gettysburg. And when people look at a military event, they tend to think militarily, right? They don't necessarily think about it as being a moment where culture shifts in the way that Fredericksburg actually does. But your question about Southern literary elites, one of the curious things about the Civil War generally is that there's very little enduring literature written by people who were actually in it and were writing about it. Probably the most famous novel by a Civil War soldier was Ben-Hur, which is written by Lew Wallace and becomes the Charlton Heston movie. But The Red Badge of Courage is written by Stephen Crane, who was born 6 years after the war ended. And so on and so forth. And so it was, in a way, perhaps an event that people who experienced it were simply too traumatized by it to write about. And it's certainly possible that those who might have written about it didn't make it through. We're talking about a war that cost 750,000 American lives. But I'm not aware really of any Southern literary elite that was alive at the time that had as much to say about it as perhaps you might expect. Probably the greatest commentator on the post-Civil War Southern psychology. There are a few, but Faulkner is the one that comes immediately to mind.
One of the stories that I like to tell on my trips, and if the folks who have traveled with me have heard this, but when you're describing a war, it's so indescribable, and I think the shock of the Civil War, really, how would you describe that as an American? And I guess one of the things that struck me, and the reason I'm telling the story, is I had a letter from a soldier in a Maine regiment, and he's trying to write home to his parents to describe the Battle of Gettysburg because it's been in all the papers. And he says, dear mother and father, you've written to ask me about the great battle fought in Gettysburg and my part in it. It was loud, your loving son. Because to him, how could he possibly,
Yeah. And it was loud. Evidently, you could hear the cannons in Pittsburgh.
And
its charge.
And you quote in your book a couple of times Walt Whitman. The real war will never get into the books.
Right.
And at one point in the book, you then write, the people who knew the war built fictions around what they had known, whether to make it grander, more personal, or simply easier to bear. Crafting some fiction or other was essential to almost everyone. So I would ask you, as a writer and perforce a historian, because you've written a book that's part history, how do you get beyond those fictions? And what was your strategy? I mean, part of it is that you're looking at the personal experiences of 5 people. What's your strategy to try to capture, in some way, the real war that's almost uncapturable?
Yeah, I think what you do or what I do is I try to immerse myself in the primary sources as much as I possibly can. I spent a lot of time at the Houghton Library at Harvard, which has the Louisa May Alcott papers and the Arthur Fuller papers. I took a trip down to Alabama to see what they had about John Pelham. Most of the Holmes and Whitman stuff is published, so it didn't require quite so much traveling. But what you do, it's kind of a balancing act, because you enter into the project with kind of a sense of the story that you want to tell, or you couldn't even get started. But you also very much have to kind of keep an open mind and try as best you can to suppress your own desires to tell the story in a certain way and let the documents speak through you. And I think that's the closest probably that anybody can come to a kind of objectivity. But also, having said that, there's a constant and somewhat daunting awareness that you can't be completely subjective, that you perceive the documents and the stories through whatever filters you've acquired in life. And the people writing it down were seeing it through the filters that they had acquired in their lives. And so you're writing always at a remove from actuality. You always want to know more than the documents are able to tell you. Sometimes you have to fill in gaps with a little bit of supposition and speculation. You try as best you can to keep that to a minimum. But a biographer always works in an atmosphere of incompleteness, incompleteness of record, incompleteness of knowledge, and also the incompleteness of the human condition. That all of the people that you write about are doing what they do because there's an absence in their lives that they're trying to fix in one way or another. Louisa May Alcott goes off to war because she feels life is passing her by, because she's bored. She says, I want something to do before she goes off to fight. And of course she has these desires to abolish slavery, to save the Union. All of that matters immensely to her. But every one of these five people also has a kind of inner gap that they're trying to fill up through action in one way or another. So anyway, the writing of any biography and probably of any history. I know more about biography than I do about straight history, and when I try to write straight history, it ends up being biography. But anytime you do that, you enter into it with a kind of pre-existing sense of limitation. That, as you say, the war never made it into the books; it never will. You try to you ask the facts. Okay, what story are you trying to say? And you try to tell that story. But there's always subjectivity, I think, that enters in.
Well, John, given kind of that answer, one of the questions I had is the majority of your characters, aside from being from New England, they have a paper trail. I mean, they're either famous, they went on to do great things. You can tell something about them. Pelham is very young, doesn't have a lot of a paper trail really, and there's a lot that we people in general project onto Pelham.
The gallant Pelham.
The gallant Pelham.
There's always the gallant Pelham, like
Yes.
it's the lost cause come
Right.
to life.
So obviously, a couple of questions came out of that. One is what drew you to him? How did you tell his side of the story? And in terms of all your other characters, you're talking about this battle and its effect on them later on.
Yeah.
What did you do with Pelham in that situation?
Sure. Chris, that's a fantastic question. It's really perceptive. Pelham has a fairly rich trove of letters that he wrote when he was at West Point, and those are fascinating, and I make pretty considerable use of those. But then we get to the Civil War, and all but one of the letters that he wrote home during the Civil War were lost, I believe, in the 19-teens or 20s. And so we only have one letter which survives because his father had it reprinted in a local newspaper after the Battle of Manassas. But he didn't keep a journal. He didn't file official reports because his superiors were doing that. And so you're right that we have with Pelham this really glorious exterior, right? The picture was up on the screen earlier. And he has these matinee idol good looks. He has this piercing gaze. And you asked me, how did I happen upon him, or how did I choose him to write about? Curiously enough, and I think this will surprise you, he was the first of the five who made an impression in my life. Because when I was probably 11, 12, 13 years old, I became kind of a Civil War buff on a very low level. But I picked up a copy of Volume 2 of Douglas Southall Freeman's 3-volume Lee's Lieutenants. And each one of those volumes begins with a sort of portrait gallery, photographs of prominent figures in the Army of Northern Virginia. And I saw Pelham's face for the first time, and it struck me. I kind of couldn't take my eyes off it. Oh my gosh, who is this? Everybody else is 45 years old with a beard, and here's this guy who looks like he might still be in high school.
Yeah.
And then I looked at the facing page, which had a brief little synopsis about him. It's only like 5 lines long, and talks about how he was killed. And so I meet this guy, and I find out that he died almost at the same moment. And he's always had a kind of romantic, not erotic, but romantic pull on me. And so I was really interested in having the opportunity to tell his story and to try to reconstruct a little bit of his psychology, which again is very difficult because he's principally we know about him because other people at the time wrote about him, and we're all captivated by him in somewhat the same way. Interestingly enough, I'm currently working diligently on a teleplay based on Worse Place Than Hell. And one of the things that's most fun about that teleplay is that I do get to fictionalize, and I do get to flesh out the psychology of John Pelham, and to explore what I consider to be one of the sort of recurring tragedies of history. The person of great talent, of virtue, of attractiveness in various fashions, who ends up on the wrong side of history and is entrapped in some ways in fighting to defend causes that, if he were in John Rawls's original position, would never have chosen to support. And so Pelham, he's interesting to write about in the current moment because he's somebody who's really ideal in everything but his politics, and his politics are horrible. Or the politics of the cause that he fights for are horrible.
Right. So it's hard to know how to feel about somebody who's gallant and romantic, and his what he does at the Battle of Fredericksburg is very dramatic and individualistic.
It's operatic. It's really incredible.
But who is also fighting for the right to buy and sell other people, and also and we don't know the view inside him, but that sometimes he acts in a way that seems in sort of the heat of battle seems nearly suicidal or
yeah,
maybe that's not the right word, but so it's hard to know how to feel about him.
It is hard to know how to feel about him. He's he in some ways is not quite as rash on the battlefield as he may appear to be. And one of the things that really distinguishes him is not just the gallantry and the bravado, but the fact that his unit was so well trained and had a precision. They were all excellent horsemen, and so they could move their guns faster than anybody else. And once they settled down to the actual waging of the battle, everything evidently just went like clockwork. And yet, at the Battle of Fredericksburg, he and his men ride out to their position with one cannon, and they managed to hold off the advance of a third of the Union Army for about an hour, giving Stonewall Jackson more opportunity, more time to entrench his men in anticipation of that coming assault, which is different from the assault on the stone walls, I would point out. But it is amazing, and he ends up, of course, with that nickname, the Gallant Pelham, that has followed him through history. And so I regard him as a deeply tragic figure, and someone really to be to be pitied, I think, because of the historical situation he finds himself in.
So let me, Chris, do you mind if I
No,
leap forward
please,
here?
it's you have the floor, sir.
Okay. So three of the people in your book are really well known.
Mhm.
The fourth you've just discussed, who is also well known, I think, to Civil War people who are knowledgeable and interested in the Civil War. The fifth person is the Reverend Arthur Fuller, who is a chaplain to a Massachusetts regiment. Is that correct?
Yes,
Well,
that's
of course, but
Yeah.
of course.
Okay, and he is somebody who is not known at all. I mean, I think he's not as you mentioned, his sister was a fairly famous person. He is not a famous person.
No.
And I am interested in, what moved you about his story, or made you want to include it in this book. What is kind of the key, factor that has you telling his story as part of this book on Fredericksburg?
Yeah, I like to think of the book as being fairly intricately balanced, and the idea was to sort of create in print something that was a little bit like a Calder mobile, where everything kind of puts everything else into equilibrium. And what's really important about Fuller in the story that I'm telling, well, there are a number of things, but one is that because he's not famous, he is kind of a sort of everyman presence in the book. He comes from a distinguished family, but is in a lot of ways an underdog. He's injured as a child. He loses an eye at the age of 10. He ends up as a Unitarian minister, and he's respected as a minister. He ends up being the chaplain of, I believe, the Massachusetts House of Representatives before the Civil War. But he has this feeling that really dogs him, that he's never really lived life, that he's never distinguished himself in the way that someone from his family ought to do. His father was a 4-term congressman from Massachusetts, and his sister, was the great female intellectual of the century in America. And so it's also with Fuller, it's kind of a different look at the idea of courage, because we've just talked about Pelham, this guy who is a consummate soldier. He's a West Point almost graduate. He's a consummate artillery tactician. He absolutely knows what he's doing on the battlefield. Arthur Fuller doesn't. Arthur Fuller hasn't fired a gun since he was a teenager. And he gets headaches, and he catches malaria, and he's a physical wreck. And in fact, right before the Battle of Fredericksburg, he's given a medical discharge because nobody thinks that he can continue to carry on his duties, even as a chaplain. And I think he becomes a chaplain because he wants to live this brave man's life, but it's about to be denied him because of his ill health. And unlike Pelham, who rides into Fredericksburg with complete command of the situation that he finds himself in, Arthur Fuller he sneaks away from his own regiment because he knows that they would send him back. And he ends up with another Massachusetts regiment going across the Rappahannock River at the very beginning of the battle, and standing alongside men he's never met with a rifle, trying to do what he can for his country. One of the last things he's heard to say is, "Sir, I must do something for my country." And it's we have a couple of examples then of courage that sort of borders on folly. Pelham with his one cannon, Fuller with his one eye and his utter ineptitude. But both people driven by, once again, a deep sense of duty and what had to be done in the moment, exposing themselves to utter catastrophe. I kind of like that balance between Fuller and Pelham, and also with regard to some of the other figures in the book.
Sort of and Chris, I'll go over to you, but it's sort of the battle is sort of a tornado of the soul that hits these different characters and kind of catapults them into directions that they maybe didn't anticipate going. I'll catapult tornado over to you, Chris.
Wow, I mean, That was pretty good coming from a minor.
That was a good metaphor.
Yeah.
I did a lot of work on that tornado. I had a whole question around it, but we'd already kind of covered that, so I wanted to work it into our conversation. As you know, I'm pretty good at doing.
You are, John. All right, boy, John. You talk about these young people, and they are young people, or most of them are young people. They're dealing with the repercussions of older people pouring two visions of America into their heads, leading up to the war. What are those two visions? I mean, did you come away thinking, was it what you expected? I guess is what I'm asking. Or
So when you talk about the two visions, you're talking about the northern vision of the future of the country.
Well, if you define it, is it a northern southern vision? Is it a Holmes's vision post-war versus say Alcott or Whitman? I mean,
yeah, I don't think it's not quite monolithic. I don't think you can necessarily say that there was a northern perspective and a southern perspective.
Right.
Certainly not a northern perspective, because there were people who were very gung-ho about saving the Union who did not give a darn about the future of African Americans, and vice versa. But so the visions become, I think, a fair bit more individualized. And in fact, part of the story that I'm trying to tell is one of kind of multiplicity of perspective within, at least among four of the five, a shared cause and a shared desired result. But something that comes across very, very clearly to me, and I don't know if it comes across as clearly in the book, though I hope that it kind of does, is that both sides of this conflict saw it in highly religious, almost apocalyptic terms. Fuller is survived by a brother named Richard, and Richard writes a brief, very admiring biography of Arthur the year after he dies, while the war is still going on. And Richard says in the Civil War chapters of it that that future generations probably are not going to understand the intensity of religious feeling that went into the struggle for the Union. And he traces it back to the Puritan origins of America, this idea of a holy mission, the last best hope on earth, as Abraham Lincoln calls it, this idea that that there's no, if we don't get it right in America, if we don't create an ideal space for democracy, for freedom, for the elevation of humankind, no one's ever going to get a chance to do it any other place ever again. So there's this deep sense of urgency, and there is a kind of theocracy or theology to that position. Whereas the South at the same time, and Lincoln talks about this in the second inaugural, that both sides are praying to the same God, and yet they have these very diametrically opposed ideas of what the will of that God will be. But the South believed in its way of life, believed in the sanctity of its land, perhaps more than anything else, and it's a good explanation for why the war goes on for so long, why it's fought tooth and nail up until almost up into the last casualty. It's because both sides had such a deep conviction that they were doing the Lord's work. And it's easy for us to see the northern perspective of that. The southern perspective is very difficult to think our way into now. But in its time, it was no less sincere.
Well, I guess one of the things that struck me was the different views of the Union effort and the outcome amongst your characters and amongst some of the other characters that I've read about. So to me, Holmes comes out, I don't know if cynical is the right word, but certainly a lot more realistic, maybe. Mm-hmm. There are very few of the trappings of the cause left. but
Yeah.
there are others that do sustain that vision of, I would love to see Whitman and Holmes sitting down over a pint talking about what did this all mean,
Yeah.
and Holmes struck me as being a lot more cynical about it or realistic about the
Yeah,
human
yeah, that's
condition.
very true. And even as I describe this kind of religious energy, you're absolutely right that not everyone felt that way. Holmes is he's by far the least convinced of divine purpose of any of the five people in the book. Um, and and Whitman's sense of America has a deep reverence to it. You read Leaves of Grass, and you can't miss the fervor with which Whitman believes in the democratic
Right.
project and the saving capacity of America. Um, and so yeah, that's another balance in this book. You've got four people, and John Pelham. I love to make note of this. When he was at West Point, he got demerits for reading the Bible after hours. Yeah, how reverent can you be? The worst thing he
Right.
does at West Point is he's reading the Bible after lights out. But that tells you a little bit about the sort of the overall reverence of that historical moment. But it is one that Holmes doesn't take part in. And Holmes, when he's wounded at Ball's Bluff or early in the war, he's conscious. He thinks he might very well die, and he asks himself, "Well, should I embrace Christ now on what may be my deathbed?" And he says, "No, that would be inconsistent with everything that I've ever done and everything I've ever believed. It would be almost cowardly, in a sense, to back off from my unbelief now, my deep religious skepticism." And yeah, I mean, Holmes comes through this crisis as a deeply scarred and shattered man, who, as I've said earlier in the hour, loses his faith in the army, loses his faith in, if he ever had any, loses his faith in God, loses his faith in law after he starts studying it, and he says, oh, it's just a bunch of dusty precedents that are based on experience rather than logic. And so he has enough of a spirit to desire to believe that he keeps trying these things out and trying to see them for what they are, but comes away from all of it with that sort of existential vision, as from that paragraph that I read. That there is something lovely in carrying on and being brave, even if you don't believe a thing about anything that's keeping it up.
John, a quick question here, as we move towards the end of our hour. How important is it to you? Both Chris and I lead historical tours, and a whole bunch of people in our audience have gone on historical tours. So they've been to battlefields and been to places. How important was it to you as a writer to visit some of the scenes that you're writing about to understand them?
I think it's essential. It was to me, at least, and I've done that with every one of my books. And fortunately, there are fantastic people at the Fredericksburg battlefield. John Hennessy, Frank O'Reilly. Mr. O'Reilly gave me a wonderful tour of the battlefield below Marie's Heights, and talked me step by step through everything that happened during that last futile charge up toward the wall. A sense of place is, to me, really indispensable. It was a bit harder to get a sense of place where Fredericksburg is concerned, because Fredericksburg, the battle itself took place, in the streets of the town, and then on the very outskirts of it. And Fredericksburg was growing then, and it kept growing after the war, so that there's really very little of the battlefield, sadly, that is now preserved. You go out to where Pelham's cannon was, and there's a drugstore. And so the places that you want to see are very often somebody's driveway. But nevertheless, to get a sense of the scale, to get a sense of the distances involved, In fact, when I went to Fredericksburg I think I visited 3 times. And once I went on the anniversary of the battle so that I could see what the angle of the sun was at the time that last charge was taking place. Are these soldiers were they squinting into the sunlight as they were heading up? And when I went to Antietam, because Antietam also factors pretty heavily in the book, I brought along a stopwatch and I timed how long it took to run across Burnside's Bridge, where Walt Whitman's brother was with his regiment. The more that you can do to familiarize yourself with the geography and to make yourself somehow a part of it, and to add not only your book knowledge, but whatever little scraps of experience you yourself can get, I think it's indispensable.
I got one more, Chris, if I can. But if you
right.
have a big closing question, you can
that's
do it.
fine.
I can do this after your big closing question.
Oh.
John, just hang on. We have to have a discussion about it. So the people who are in the audience of this program know that if I can find a way to make a connection between our topic and the Ghost Army, here's to the Ghost Army, right? That I'm going to try to do that. And you might think it's complicated or difficult in the case of our interview with John Madison, but it's not, because, John, you actually knew one of the soldiers in this unit. And I want to explain to people that Lieutenant Fred Fox, Princeton 39, Chris, stop sighing, is a key,
you said it was a question.
Is a key character in the Ghost Army story. He actually wrote the official U.S. Army history of the unit, which is probably the most delightful official U.S. Army history ever written. And his post-war career involved being a minister, a journalist, and a White House aide. And eventually he came back to Princeton, where he became recording secretary and also held the unofficial title Keeper of Princetonia. And my understanding is that he was a pretty unforgettable figure when you were there at Princeton, which we don't even want to say how long ago that was, but was a while ago.
He was in the fading years of his life. He passed away before my class graduated. But when I started at Princeton, I'll be upfront about this. I started at Princeton in the fall of 1979, and Fred Fox, class of 1939. A classmate of John F. Kennedy. Not too many people know that Kennedy was a Princetonian before he transferred to Harvard. But Fred Fox Fred Fox was revered at Princeton, and it was customary for him to appear in Alexander Hall, surrounded by the entering freshmen and women. And to teach them the kind of the sacred song of Princeton, which is Old Nassau, and there are hand gestures and arm gestures and so on that go with it, and so yes, I got to learn the Old Nassau under the tutelage of the late great Fred Fox, class of 39.
So there you go. Can I ask a question? Can we get back to the conversation?
Oh my God! Well, you have like 30 seconds, but yeah, go ahead. You can close it.
I was going to give this one to Karen because she's from the eastern provinces of Canada. Right? So here we go. I did that all by myself.
Woo!
Karen wants to know, of the 5 primary people featured in your book, if you had to choose to live one of their lives, who would you choose and why?
Wow.
No pressure.
Very hard question, because each one of them endured a lot of pain, a great deal of suffering in one way or another. And so if you're looking for an easy life, the answer would be none of the above. I think that I would have preferred to be Oliver Wendell Holmes, because Oliver Wendell Holmes was a man of authentic genius. I think I've only really written about 2 actual geniuses. Margaret Fuller was one, and Holmes. So to have that brain power would have been remarkable. To have lived the social life of the Boston Brahmin, I think would have been fascinating. And also as a failed lawyer who fired off his last brief in anger in 1991, now, going on 30 years ago. I would really have loved to have had those kinds of legal smarts on top of everything else. So in spite of the 3 woundings, in spite of getting shot through the neck, I would take Holmes.
There you go.
Well, John Madison, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about 5 extraordinary individuals and their intersection at the Battle of Fredericksburg, and your book, A Worse Place Than Hell, How the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg Changed a Nation. So we really appreciate your spending a few moments with us, and if you hang on, we'll wrap off the show and say goodbye to you off the air.
Outstanding. I'll stick around.
All right. And Chris, we should probably mention our next week's show.
That would be helpful.
And I think, I hope I have it right here. History Happy Hour next week. We're doing Exercise Tiger. And this is the D-Day rehearsal at Slapton Sands that went horribly wrong. And our guest is a renowned naval historian, Craig Simons, who wrote the book Operation Neptune, which is about the entire naval component of D-Day. And who knows, maybe we'll expand off of Exercise Tiger and talk about that stuff. And I know many of the people who are listening, watching, have been in that room, which was the Operation Neptune headquarters at Suffolk House in Portsmouth. So maybe we can learn a little bit more about that.
I might have a few pictures of that, actually.
You really? That's
Oddly
hard.
enough.
It's hard to
I know
believe.
it is. It's hard to
I
believe.
might have your pictures. You might already have sent them to me. Oh well, another show, Chris. I think we've succeeded in fooling people again.
I hope so. Stay safe, everyone.